On a rainy morning in June 1815, the fate of Europe balanced on a single battlefield. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the undisputed master of the continent, now found himself challenged by an alliance of resolute adversaries determined to end his reign of conquest. Across the sodden farmland near the Belgian village of Waterloo, thousands of soldiers, British, Dutch, Belgian, German, and Prussian, readied themselves for what would become one of the most decisive showdowns in military history. Would Napoleon reassert the dominance he once wielded, or would the combined forces under the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Blücher prevail, sealing the emperor's fate for good? Stay tuned for a sprawling 2-hour dive into the Battle of Waterloo, where miscalculations, battlefield heroics, and sheer determination shaped the destiny of Europe. Every thunderous cannon blast echoed political tensions that had built up across the continent. The day's outcome would rewrite national boundaries, alter military doctrines, and remind leaders everywhere of the fragile line between power and downfall. If you've ever wondered how one engagement could so profoundly influence modern Europe, you're about to find out. Prepare for an odyssey through strategy, leadership, sacrifice, and ambition. This is the story of Napoleon's last stand. Welcome to Thunder at Waterloo, Napoleon's last stand in 1815. In this extensive 2-hour documentary, we'll trace the epic events culminating in one of history's most famous battles, the confrontation that ended over a decade of near-constant warfare across Europe. From Napoleon's remarkable return from Elba to the final cavalry charges against British squares, we'll peel back the layers of strategy and chance that determined the fate of nations. Throughout this film, we'll explore the personal motivations of the key figures. Napoleon, the brilliant yet often impulsive commander. The Duke of Wellington, whose calm under fire proved invaluable to the Allied cause. And Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher, whose dogged persistence turned the battle's tide in the Allies' favor. Along the way, we'll spotlight the experiences of rank-and-file soldiers, from French conscripts who idolized the emperor to British infantry who stood stoically in the face of thundering cavalry charges. So settle in for a comprehensive look at the Napoleonic Wars' grand finale, a day of mud, blood, and high-stakes drama that reconfigured the geopolitical map of Europe and shaped the course of the 19th century. Join us now as we step into the muddy fields of Waterloo, where the dreams of an empire clashed with the unwavering resolve of the Allied forces. In early 1815, few Europeans believed they would ever face Napoleon Bonaparte in open conflict again. After all, the Emperor of the French had been exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean, presumably locked away from the levers of power. Yet, in a move that stunned the crowned heads of Europe, Napoleon orchestrated his daring escape. Landing near Cannes, on the southern coast of France, with only a small retinue of loyal guards, he began a bold march northward toward Paris. French peasants and soldiers alike flocked to his banner, enthralled by the legend of the man who had once nearly dominated the continent. Within mere weeks, the returning emperor transformed from a perceived outlaw to a national hero. Marshal Ney, dispatched by King Louis XVIII to arrest him, famously switched allegiances upon meeting Napoleon, reportedly exclaiming that no one could truly resist his former commander. The Bourbon monarchy that had replaced Napoleon's regime found itself in a precarious position. Its attempts to rouse public sentiment against the usurper failed miserably. The people still recalled the glories of the Grande Armée, preferring the iron will of Napoleon to the perceived weakness of Louis XVIII. By the time Napoleon reached Paris in March 1815, he had effectively reclaimed his old throne without firing a single shot. This triumphant return ignited the period known as the 100 Days, during which the emperor sought to consolidate his power and re-establish French supremacy. But outside French borders, Europe's monarchs seethed, uniting once more to quash the man they deemed the greatest threat to continental stability. Though jubilant crowds greeted Napoleon in the capital, he knew that fierce resistance loomed. Diplomats and generals from Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia rapidly reconvened, forging a renewed alliance dedicated to removing the French emperor once and for all. Napoleon recognized the narrowness of his window for decisive action, and thus the final chapter of his storied career began. In the wake of Napoleon's extraordinary comeback, Europe's leaders recognized they could no longer allow him the luxury of reorganizing his empire. Representatives from Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia had gathered in Vienna for a diplomatic congress designed to reshape the continent after years of warfare. But their discussions took on an entirely new urgency once word of the emperor's escape arrived. In a matter of days, old rivalries were overshadowed by the singular goal of dethroning Napoleon for good. Among these powers, Britain emerged as a critical financial and strategic linchpin. Under the guidance of the Prince Regent's government, substantial funds were pledged to support field armies from Prussia and other German states. While Austria hesitated to commit immediately, still battered from previous conflicts with France, Britain pressed on, focusing on forging a formidable land force near the Belgian frontier. There, under the leadership of Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, a British-led coalition began assembling to stand against the returning emperor. Simultaneously, Prussia, with its legacy of resilience and pride under leaders like Frederick the Great, contributed a sizable contingent to the cause. In Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher, the Prussian army possessed a fearless commander who harbored a personal vendetta against Napoleon's repeated humiliations of Prussia in earlier wars. While Austria guarded Vienna and Russia watched events cautiously from the east, the immediate threat revolved around Napoleon's drive toward the north, where Wellington and Blücher waited. As intelligence reports fluttered into coalition headquarters, it became increasingly evident that Napoleon planned a preemptive strike to disrupt the Allies before they could fully unite. For the coalition, time was of the essence. If the emperor could tackle these armies separately, he might yet secure a swift victory, bolstering his standing at home and demoralizing the Allied leadership. Under these precarious conditions, each side prepared for a showdown that promised to decide Europe's future once and for all. Napoleon's entire career was built on surprise, speed, and decisive action, traits he hoped would again tip the balance in his favor. Aware that the best chance of victory lay in preventing the British and Prussian armies from converging, he formulated a bold plan: strike first in Belgium. If he could smash Wellington's Anglo-Allied forces and then turn to defeat Blücher's Prussians, France might escape the stranglehold of surrounding nations. In early June, the French army quietly massed near the Belgian border. This formidable force, though smaller than Napoleon's previous Grande Armée, still boasted disciplined veterans and skilled marshals like Ney and Grouchy. However, time had wrought some changes. Newer conscripts lacked the combat experience of earlier campaigns, and some officers harbored lingering doubts about the emperor's ultimate success. Morale remained high, yet the looming confrontation was daunting. Logistical headaches plagued Napoleon's plan. Heavy spring rains threatened to slow troop movements, turning roads into mud-slick nightmares. Supplies were never guaranteed, forcing the emperor to manage his resources with precision. Meanwhile, personal rivalries among his marshals occasionally flared, adding friction to what needed to be a carefully choreographed operation. Undeterred, Napoleon continued pressing for a swift campaign. His approach had worked wonders in past battles like Austerlitz and Jena, where rapid maneuvers overwhelmed uncoordinated enemies. But the Allied leaders had studied these tactics, vowing not to be caught flat-footed. Wellington, though initially uncertain of Napoleon's exact location, anticipated a strike somewhere along the Belgian frontier. Blücher, too, was resolved to join forces with Wellington if threatened. As dawn broke on June 15th, French troops crossed the frontier under the Emperor's watchful eye, setting into motion a chain of events that would culminate in the epic confrontation at Waterloo. By June 17th, Napoleon's forces had clashed in minor engagements with Allied units, forcing the British and their allies to fall back to a ridgeline near the hamlet of Waterloo, about a dozen miles south of Brussels. The Duke of Wellington recognized the topographical advantages of the position. A gently sloping ridge, lined by key strongpoints such as Hougoumont, Laai Sant, and Papelotte. These farms and structures, though small, could act as natural fortifications around which Wellington's troops might rally. On that same evening, a monumental storm descended upon the region. Sheets of rain pounded the farmland, turning fields into mire. Soldiers from both sides were left drenched, huddling in soaked tents or trying to sleep on sodden ground. Horses shivered under improvised shelters, and cannons threatened to bog down in the mud. This deluge had a notable strategic consequence. Napoleon decided to delay his main assault the following morning in hopes that the ground would dry enough for artillery and cavalry operations. Within Wellington's ranks, tension mingled with a grim resolve. The Anglo-Allied forces were a multinational mix: British regulars, Dutch-Belgian contingents, and troops from various German principalities. While many British officers displayed confidence in the Duke's leadership, the less experienced units worried about the upcoming clash with Napoleon's veterans. For them, stories of the Emperor's brilliance loomed large. Still, the Allies placed significant trust in their prepared defensive line, suspecting that the ridge, combined with the skill of British infantry, might offset the Emperor's prowess. Napoleon, meanwhile, exuded a cool confidence, but privately felt the weight of the upcoming battle. His empire's resurgence hinged on routing Wellington quickly and turning on the Prussians next. As he studied the ridgelines by twilight, only the constant drumming of rain and distant thunder answered him. Dawn would bring clarity and confrontation. The fate of Europe hinged on the next day's outcome. The date was June 18, 1815, and although Napoleon desired an early start, the waterlogged ground forced him to postpone his opening move. It was nearly 11 a.m. before the first cannon blasts shattered the tense silence. The Emperor directed his artillery to pound Wellington's right flank, specifically targeting the stout walls and orchards of Hugummont. This fortified chateau and farm complex quickly became the epicenter of a ferocious struggle. The British guards defending Hugummont encountered the initial waves of French infantry, who surged forward under swirling clouds of gunpowder smoke. The orchard and surrounding hedges soon turned into a deadly maze. Musket fire echoed off stone walls, while attackers clambered over fences and gates, only to be met by fierce volley after volley. Despite French numerical superiority, the defenders used every advantage of the terrain: courtyards, barns, and thick garden walls that slowed the attackers' momentum. Hugummont thus served two strategic purposes. For Napoleon, capturing it could threaten Wellington's right flank, potentially unraveling the Allied line. For Wellington, holding Hugummont was not just about denying the French access, it was also a tactic to draw and pin down significant French manpower. As more French regiments were thrown into the fight, fewer were left free to exploit weaknesses elsewhere. Soon, the orchard itself became a grisly battleground. Broken muskets, abandoned hats, and wounded soldiers lay sprawled between rows of fruit trees. Cannon fire from both sides tore through the farmland, setting small fires and adding black smoke to the swirling gloom. While chaos raged within Hougoummont's walls, the wider battlefield also flared up, indicating that the fight for Waterloo was only just beginning. The fate of Europe had truly arrived on that drenched and bloody ground. Around midday, Marshal Ney surveyed the battlefield and interpreted the Allied lines in the center as wavering, possibly due to the intense fighting at Hougoumont and preliminary engagements along the ridge. Believing the British might be on the brink of collapse, he ordered a massive cavalry assault to break Wellington's front. Troopers from the French cuirassiers and dragoons thundered onto the field, glinting breastplates reflecting the intermittent sunlight that pierced the lingering clouds. As the French horsemen surged forward at a gallop, their hooves kicked up a muddy spray, uniting into a mass of steel and horsepower that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying to behold. Yet, Wellington had anticipated such a tactic. Quickly, Allied infantry regiments formed tight squares, each square a bristling wall of bayonets, with outer ranks kneeling and inner ranks standing, muskets leveled. When the French cavalry charged in, they found no disorganized lines to cut through, but disciplined clusters braced for impact. The cavalry circled these squares repeatedly, sabers flashing and bugles echoing, searching for weak points. However, the resolute redcoats and Allied infantry unleashed deadly volleys whenever the horsemen came close. Horses, spooked by gunshots, veered away at the last second. Riders toppled from saddles, and the impetus of the charge slowly faltered. Ney, increasingly frantic, sent in further cavalry waves, convinced that one final push might shatter the Allied squares. But the mud, the Allied squares' discipline, and well-timed artillery support stymied these repeated assaults. For nearly 2 hours, cavalry units circled like wolves around a stubborn prey, achieving little besides mounting casualties. Exhausted French troopers withdrew to regroup, their proud formations in disarray, leaving the British line battered but miraculously unbroken. Thus, Ney's gamble, far from delivering a swift victory, served primarily to wear down French cavalry strength, draining a critical resource the Emperor would direly need as the day advanced. While the drama of massive cavalry charges drew much attention, another pivotal struggle simmered at Laai Sant, a fortified farmhouse anchoring the center of Wellington's line. Staffed by members of the King's German Legion, the garrison endured relentless pressure as French infantry pressed their advantage in the early afternoon. Positioned between Hugummont to the west and Papelotte to the east, Laai Sant was crucial. If it fell, the French could pierce the Anglo-Allied center, potentially rolling up Wellington's entire position. The defenders, numbering only a few hundred, understood the gravity of their role. Under a seemingly endless barrage of cannon fire and musketry, they held the farm's stone walls, gates, and upper floors. Muzzle flashes lit the dim interior, while acrid smoke made it hard to breathe. Outside, French columns advanced methodically, seeking weak points and exploiting every lull to get closer. At times, the pitched fighting turned hand to hand, with bayonets and sabers clashing in the doorways and courtyards. Supplies and ammunition ran dangerously low for the defenders. Despite multiple pleas for reinforcements or fresh cartridges, support arrived inconsistently. Wellington simply had too many fires to extinguish across the sprawling battlefield. Around 6 p.m., the French succeeded in overwhelming the exhausted garrison. One final assault breached the courtyard, driving surviving defenders to retreat behind Allied lines. Laai Sant fell, and with it, the immediate threat to the Allied center became dire. For Napoleon's staff, capturing Laai Sant was a beacon of hope, an indication that the battle might finally tip in the emperor's favor. However, exhaustion, miscommunications, and the broader tactical situation prevented the French from exploiting this foothold as quickly or decisively as they needed. Even as the farmhouse changed hands, the day's outcome was far from sealed. The Allies fought on, refusing to concede the crucial ridge behind the farmhouse. As twilight began to descend, distant booms of artillery signaled the approach of Blücher's Prussian army. Rushing from the east, these columns had marched tirelessly through muddy, rutted roads after their initial engagement with part of Napoleon's forces at Ligny days prior. Field Marshal Blücher, though in his 70s, displayed unyielding energy and resolve, driven by a personal vendetta against the emperor who once humiliated Prussia. When Prussian scouts confirmed the location of the main French army locked in combat with Wellington, Blücher steeled his men for a decisive intervention. The French flank, relatively thin after committing significant forces to the assaults at Hougoumont, Laai Sant, and repeated cavalry charges, provided a prime target. As the 1st Prussian Division struck the French right around the village of Plancenoit, panic rippled through Napoleon's ranks. He had hoped to crush Wellington before the Prussians could arrive, but now found himself fighting a two-front battle. Napoleon dispatched reinforcements, including the vaunted Young Guard, to stabilize Plancenoit. Intense street fighting erupted, with Prussians and French exchanging musket fire at point-blank range among burning houses. The swirling smoke and confusion made coordination increasingly difficult. Still, Blücher pushed relentlessly forward, knowing that if he could fully engage the French flank, Wellington would be freed to launch a final assault from the ridge. This was the moment Napoleon dreaded. The odds had always hinged on preventing a coalition of British and Prussian forces. Now, that scenario was a reality. The Emperor's forces, worn from hours of fighting in soggy fields, struggled to resist fresh Prussian units, fueled by the desire for revenge. The tide, which had briefly seemed in Napoleon's favor, began to shift inexorably. Soldiers on both sides sensed the battle was approaching a climatic resolution. Sensing that time was running out, and with Blücher's presence growing more threatening by the minute, Napoleon unleashed his ultimate trump card, the Imperial Guard. Renowned throughout Europe for their discipline and near-mythic reputation, these veteran regiments had served as the emperor's hammer in countless previous campaigns. Dressed in their distinctive bearskins and dark coats, they advanced in proud columns through the wreckage of the battlefield, each step resonating with destiny. Allied forces watched with apprehension. Even after a grueling day, the Guard's arrival could break their lines if given the slightest opening. Napoleon aimed them at Wellington's center, hoping a final, resolute push would shatter the Anglo-Allied line and force a mass retreat before the Prussians fully pressed in. Drums rolled, and the Guard marched through dense smoke toward the ridge, unwavering in the face of Allied artillery. However, the Allies were ready. Wellington's battered but determined infantry prepared fresh volleys. As the Imperial Guard closed in, they faced an onslaught of musket and cannon fire from multiple angles. The once unbreakable columns wavered beneath the punishing hail of lead. Gaps formed in the ranks, and the forward momentum slowed. Allied morale soared, bolstered by the knowledge that the Guard was not invincible. In a key moment, Allied infantry unleashed volley after volley, thinning the ranks of the Guard. A wave of realization spread among the French veterans. The unstoppable had been stopped. Step by step, they faltered, Some regiments attempted an orderly withdrawal, while others broke outright. The intangible aura of invincibility that had surrounded them for years dissolved in seconds. Napoleon, watching from a nearby vantage point, recognized that his greatest asset was compromised. The heart sank in every French soldier who witnessed the Imperial Guard in retreat. This was the moment the battle, and effectively the war, was decided. As dusk settled on June 18, 1815, the outcome at Waterloo was unmistakable. The French army, once proud and feared, now dissolved into fleeing columns across the Belgian countryside. Napoleon tried to rally remnants of his forces, but the combined weight of Wellington's final counterattack and the relentless Prussian assault proved overwhelming. Soldiers who had marched confidently under the tricolor that morning found themselves in disarray, their emperor's dream of a renewed empire slipping away. For the Allied side, the victory was monumental, but far from easy. Thousands lay dead or wounded on the rolling fields. British redcoats, Dutch-Belgian volunteers, Hanoverian and Brunswick troops, and the brave men from the King's German Legion who had held key strong points. Prussian casualties also mounted, attesting to the ferocity of their late arrival and assault. Nevertheless, a collective sense of relief spread among the Allied ranks. They had stood firm against the might of Napoleon's final thrust. In the ensuing days, Napoleon abdicated once more, ultimately surrendering to the British and finding himself exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, far from the shores of Europe. The Battle of Waterloo capped an era of nearly 2 decades of conflict across the continent. The Napoleonic Wars had profoundly reshaped political alliances and spurred developments in warfare, nationalism, and statecraft that echoed through the 19th century. For many Europeans, Waterloo was not just a single day's battle. It was a moment when empires pivoted, a turning point after which the balance of power shifted. Over time, memorials rose on that blood-soaked ground, testifying to the sacrifices of men on both sides. To this day, Waterloo symbolizes the downfall of one of history's most formidable leaders and the dawn of a new geopolitical order. The era of Napoleon had ended, and with it, a chapter of grand ambition and profound upheaval in Europe's story. Thank you for journeying with us through Thunder at Waterloo, Napoleon's last stand in 1815. We've explored the intricacies of each phase of the battle, the desperate fight for Hougoumont, the audacious cavalry charges led by Ney, the brutal siege of Laai Sant, and the unforgettable final stand of the Imperial Guard. Together, these events marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars and paved the way for a lasting peace, albeit one that set the stage for the transformations of 19th century Europe. If you found this documentary insightful, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to support our efforts in bringing pivotal historical moments to life. The Battle of Waterloo stands as a testament to the fleeting nature of power, the chaos of war, and the determination of those who stood firm in the face of overwhelming odds. From Napoleon's last gamble to Wellington and Blücher's steadfast cooperation, we see how leadership and bravery can tilt the scale of history in just a single day. Stay tuned for more explorations into the conflicts, personalities, and extraordinary stories that shaped our modern world. Until next time, may the echoes of Waterloo remind us that the ambitions of empires and the resilience of defenders remain central themes in the ongoing narrative of humanity.